let me very briefly give you a background about what I was trying to do. I roughly about I don't know, maybe about a couple of years ago, I kind of felt like I was losing touch with the people in the Scrum community because my wife and I, we moved out here to Australia about 4 years ago, and Australia is a long way from anywhere. And I kind of felt that I was starting to lose touch with people, and there are new people coming into the community that I, haven't met, and there were people that I hadn't seen for a long time, such as yourself. And so, what I wanted to do was I wanted to find an excuse to, reach out and talk to people, just to chat.
That's cool.
And I'm one of these people that need an excuse to do things, and. So the excuse that I created for myself was that I would do interviews, and I would do interviews to ask people about how they came into the Scrum community, and just to chat about where they came from.
Okay, and in my case, maybe how I got out of the Scrum community. Although I guess I'm still in it, just not in the Scrum Alliance community.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to talk about that, I'd be really interested to hear about that story. I don't know the full details. I know some of it, but I'd love to hear about the full details.
Yeah, well, I got in real early. And are you recording now? That's kind of cool if you are.
Yep.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, if you are, that's fine. So I got in real early. I don't remember exactly when, but I was doing Agile is where I knew that's what I was doing. Because I think I was doing it beforehand, but I didn't know that's what it was called. But as early as '99, when I heard Martin Fowler talk about extreme programming, I thought, wow, this is cool stuff. And by 2000, 2001, we were doing Scrum. I don't know when Ken's book came out, but whatever year it came out, I read it. And I was at all the early Scrum gatherings. Actually, we sponsored one of the early ones when... Like, I remember that one of the gatherings we went to was like 50 people. That might have been the first one. And
wow.
The first 2 or 3 or 4 years, I was really avid about Scrum because it at that time, there was no good way to explain why does this doing things in little steps make any sense? I mean, intuitively, I'd been doing it for a while. But from a business point of view, it was difficult to explain. And Ken was really good at explaining it. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. This adjusting and responding, building small pieces, and this discipline. And Agile and Scrum were, at that point, not quite synonymous, but iterations. I remember I would describe Agile as iterative, incremental, and integrated.
Yeah.
That if you were doing those 3 things, that was the essence of it. And Agile and iterations, or sprints, to use the Scrum term, were like, they were connected. The thought of like what Kanban and Flow is now just never occurred to me or anybody else, I think. So I was actually really into the Scrum community. We had a lot of CSTs like other people did. I never became a CST because basically I was doing other things, and I was the CEO of Net Objectives, well, still am. And being a CST seemed to be not where I should be focusing, because then there was a very limited number of CSTs in those days. It was very difficult to get a CST in your company.
Yeah.
And basically, so I had, but I had a couple. We did a lot of Scrum training. I did other kinds of Agile training. And this went on for about 3 or 4 years, till around 2004, 2005, when 2 things started bothering me.
Mm-hmm.
One was we kept running into organizations where Scrum would not work.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't work for any number of reasons. And one of the reasons was if it was big, there was no way to create a common vision to get people to work together.
Yeah.
At Scrum of Scrums, we never could figure out how to get that to work. In fact, we never did. We did other things right from the very beginning. I go back to my early writings, and we talked about, now I can't remember what we called it, but it was some group that now is actually kind of, you could think of it as a separate group of product owners talking to each other, but I forget what we called it back then. But it was the early stages of some high-level contextual view of how to manage multiple teams and multiple projects working together. So one thing was this lack of vision to create for people to come together. And the other problem was there were times when Scrum as a team method or framework wouldn't work, where iterations just weren't the right approach, where having cross-functional teams weren't the right approach. And it was all I'd ever hear is, no, Scrum will always work, you just have to follow it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. There are times you don't want to follow it. There are times when you have key people and you cannot get like somebody with the experience you need on every team. Then what do you do? And nobody was listening to me. It was very frustrating. And what started happening is I started bringing the notion of lean in, because I started seeing that lean could create the bigger vision. I did not know how to solve this problem with key men or key women or whatever, but there were some things about lean that seemed very appealing, and I started talking about it in the community. And it was really bizarre, because when I would talk about it in the community, I would get a positive response when I would be with Scrum folks. But if I would talk about it openly, I was slapped on the wrist all the time. And eventually that led to me being thrown off the Scrum development group, because it didn't slow me down just because Ken didn't like me talking about it. So that was a piece of it. The other piece of it is I really still don't like the way the Scrum certifies trainers, because what happens is companies make investments, get a CST, and then the CST leaves.
Yeah.
I thought that was a bad business model. I told Ken that was a bad business model. The moment he came up with the CST program, I said, this is not a good model, because it serves the individual, it doesn't serve the organization. And then, every year you would see people getting CST and then leaving the company, setting out their own shingle. And I just personally didn't like it, even though everybody was making a lot of money out of it. It didn't seem right. So those two factors really had me decide, well, I got my hands tied when I'm in this community, so I'm going to go elsewhere. It didn't change my opinion of Scrum. I think Scrum is a really good framework for teams to work in. We do a lot of Scrum. We teach Scrum all the time. We're safe silver partners, and that's based on Scrum. But I didn't like the way it was being organized to expand, and that's basically why I left. Now, admittedly, I might have left in a calmer way, or might not have dissed some things. I'm maturing. But that was my main thing, was that. It wasn't Scrum itself. So I also really, I gotta say, I really like what Ken did with Scrum.org. We had been talking for years that you needed to do team training and not certified Scrum Master training.
Yeah.
So when he started doing that, I said, well, good for you. That's what you should have been doing for years. I've been talking about that as well, to no avail. So I think the resurgence of technical practices into Scrum, and that it's a team training now instead of a Scrum Master training, is really important. Because if you think about it, if you've only got 2 days to do training, if you spend any time on how does the Scrum Master be, that's time less for how does the team be.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you want to do a 3-day training that explains all the Scrum Master role and all the team role, then that's cool. But most people don't have that kind of money or time. So I think Scrum.org actually is moving in the right direction with how they're going. They're also going through the rep approach, where you have materials and people get certified in being able to do that. So, I guess Ken's learned some of his lessons, because I'm not interested in working with Scrum.org, but I got to say I like the model they're using a whole lot better than what I saw when I was with the Scrum Alliance and then broke off. Now, the other thing we've done, and it's funny because I've been accused of liking one thing or promoting one thing, and what's ridiculous about that is I'm the only guy who does everything. Think about it. I do Scrum, I do Kanban, I do XP. I used to be an accredited LKU instructor with the Kanban method. I still do the Kanban method. it's just one tool I have in my toolbox. I'm the only guy carrying around 6 tools. Everybody else has got 2 or 3, and they think they're have variety. So my thinking, actually, the big umbrella for me is Lean. Lean is kind of a mindset and a framework, and it's based on just a few key principles that I guess the essence of Lean for me goes back, or the foundation, not the essence. There is a difference. What it's built on goes back to something I've been doing for 30 years, and that's Deming. Look to systems, trust that people are basically good, and if you put them in a good environment, they'll do good work.
Yep.
If you put them in a bad environment, you'll suppress them, and they won't get good work done. And that you don't need to, try to cajole them to do good, because they naturally want to do good. But you've got to remove what's in their way, and that takes improving the system, but it also takes good management. It's not something that people by themselves can do, because it's in a big organization. There are lots of impediments that the individuals can't do, but create the right environment, then let them do well, self-organize within that environment. And then Lean builds on that foundation. by adding the notion of don't stop the workflow.
Yep.
When you start work, keep it going until it's delivered. Well, the only way you can do that is if you've got small batches. So Lean talks about just-in-time, small batches. It talks about testing. It actually talks a lot about testing, which most people I don't think realize. But if you read, because most of the books I read about Lean don't talk about testing. But if you go back to Ono's book, the Toyota Production System, he talks about this thing called automation, and he means automation with a human touch. And of course, manufacturing is a lot different than software, so don't try to do this in software what they do in manufacturing, but take the essence of it. The essence of it is things should run well, and when they don't, then you stop and figure out what it is, get it to run well again, and then go back to that, and you continuously improve the system when something goes wrong. But that you shouldn't be testing things in, and you shouldn't be having to manage the process. It should flow smoothly as you do things. Excuse me. So, just allergies.
That's all good.
So, the more I study Lean and the more I talk to different people outside of the core Lean community, a lot of things fit into it. Like Bob Charette, actually, I didn't know this, but he actually was the one who coined the term Lean software development. He wrote a paper, I think it was in the 90s.
I didn't know
Yeah. Mary and Tom did not coin the term, even though they're the ones who get all the credit for it. Charette wrote, and I don't remember what year it was. It could have been as early as 89, but it was definitely no later than 99. But I think it was the late 80s. He wrote an article called Lean Software Development. And I didn't read it until I didn't know who Bob was until about 5 years ago at the first Lean Kanban conference in Miami. He was there, and it was the second one. It was the one, whatever one was after Miami. It was that one, and he was there, and he told me this, and I was talking to him. And he's a risk guru. This guy is just amazingly smart, probably the number one risk guy in the country or world. And he was telling me about this, and he tied that notion together. And if you start studying, if you start taking the principles, the foundation, I should say, these principles from Lean and Deming and apply them to software, then the practices show up differently. But basically, the idea is work on as small value pieces as you can that make sense from a deployment point of view. And don't work on too many things so you have to stop work. Like I love David Anderson's phrase, stop starting and start finishing. But I actually came up with one myself just the other day. It just hit me. Finishing, it's stop stopping. Do you know what I mean? Like you're working and then you stop. And you stop because you need somebody else, or you stop because you don't know something, or you stop because a bug happens and the testers aren't, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you have a stoppage in the workflow, and that's bad. So it's like stop stopping. How do you set it up so you don't have to stop, so you don't have to keep stopping? And these mantras really, I think, guide you no matter where you are. Then Scrum, if you view it as part of the Lean world, becomes a lot better because you can see how to extend it. And I'm happy to say that the Scrum community is finally acknowledging it's a manifestation of Lean. I have to admit, I still get a little irritated. I get less and less as time goes on because I am maturing a little bit. But I get a little less irritated every year that back 6 years ago when I was saying this, I was told, no, it isn't. It has nothing to do with Lean and all that. But it's at least good now that it's being said that it is Lean. It is. It's a partial implementation of Lean thinking, and it's quite good. And when you actually acknowledge that and see that, then when it doesn't quite work, you can use Lean thinking to get you to the next level. That's why I'm not trying to say Scrum's a part of Lean or a kind of Lean so you'll do Lean. I think that's how you can enhance Scrum. In fact, I'm doing a webinar in 4 weeks on enhancing Scrum with Lean. Because then when you get stuck, you can say, well, wait a minute, why do I have iterations? Well, and there are a variety of objectives, reasons you have iterations. Well, I'm having troubles doing this one. Maybe instead of just not doing it, instead of don't do Scrum but, I'm going to look at what's the intention and how could I use Lean to get a better intention. There are like two kinds of Scrum buts in a sense. One is, well, we're doing Scrum, but it's too hard to do it this way, so we're not doing that. And that's an accommodation, and that's virtually never good. Or it could be, well, we're doing Scrum, but we can't have fully cross-functional teams because one guy's needed for 3 teams. So what we've done is we've set up a Kanban board for this person so we can be shared across the 3 teams. So, that's good Scrum because you're getting the intention of it. So that's kind of my approach. Is I'm always trying to figure out what works, and then pull from whatever mindset there is. But if you just pull from the mindset and principles, it gets too theoretical.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm good with that, but most people, they tell me what to do. I need to know what to do.
Something practical.
So then yeah, exactly. So then you want to, oh, well, here you use this part of Scrum, here you use that part of Kanban, but it's really you're just solving the problem based on the laws of nature of software development as a phenomenon. And anyway, that's kind of what I do.
So you mentioned briefly through that, you mentioned talking about using Scrum within Lean, or I can't remember the exact words that you used.
Within the context of Lean.
Within the context of Lean, yeah. Yeah,
so think about this. So one of the biggest problems people have with scaling Scrum is the inside a team it works well, but across teams it has difficulties.
Yeah.
So, well, how do you solve that problem? Well, Scrum of Scrums has been attempted, but
not terribly successful in my experience.
No, yeah, I have a standing request for anybody in the community to give me one success of Scrum working.
Yeah.
And so far, I've got none.
Yeah.
Nobody's come to me. So it's like, just stop talking about it, please. Because if it does work, tell me. And if it doesn't work, let's stop talking about it. But the reason it doesn't work is inter-team dynamics are quite different than intra-team dynamics when it comes to decision making. Yeah. See, Scrum works really well when it comes to communication.
Yes.
That's fine, because then you're just letting people know, and that's not a bad method. So how do you coordinate teams? Well, does it mean you don't do Scrum? Does it mean you have to do command and control and a high big view? And the answer is no, of course not. Mm-hmm. You have to use Lean at the high level to manage workflow. So you say, well, what's the what's the business increment we're trying to deliver? Think about it from a corporate point of view, deliver value quickly. Now, how do I get my teams to deliver value quickly? Well, maybe if I need to break the work up, I need to break it up in a way that the teams can work together. So they're working on the same things at the same time. Because if they're working on unrelated things, like in the first sprint, and then they work on unrelated things in the second sprint, you can't integrate. You can't test if you've got it working. If you work on, well, these are all the dependent things. The first sprint, we're going to do that. Then we're going to do the next sprint that are related to each other. Then you're shortening the time. You're cutting out the delay between building something and then validating it. So if you say, well, I'm going to use Lean to make sure that my workflow is quick, I get something started and done,
mm-hmm.
then I can now do Scrum within that context. So that's what I mean by doing it within the context of Lean.
Right. Okay.
I also mean recognize that the reason Scrum works, in my opinion, is not so much that you have self-organizing cross-functional teams, but by having cross-functional teams, you basically cut out a lot of the amount of work in process you have and a lot of the delays you have inherently. Well, if you recognize that, then when you have a backlog for the sprint, what you'll want to do is, even if you're not managing work in process or WIP limits, you'll still say, I want to have as few stories open as possible, because that's the Lean concept. Because then I'll do things just in time instead of a lot at once. So I'm doing Scrum, but I'm doing it within these kind of rules and things like that. That actually helps a lot. I was just thinking, there was one thing that crossed my mind when I was talking to you, just to kind of flirt through, but it was a good concept in explaining this about Scrum within Lean. But I guess hopefully it'll come back. That happens to me at times. If I said everything that was on my mind, you'd have about 3 conversations going on at once. So sometimes something goes through there and I don't say it. I can't remember what it said. Yeah.
Happens to all of us.
Oh, but yeah. Well, the other thing about this is, then if you think about it, if you do Scrum or if you do Kanban, you can mix those two together as long as they're within the bigger picture context that you're working on. So that's what's really good. So in a lot of ways, the intention now becomes, it doesn't matter whether you call it Scrum or whether you call it Lean or whether you call it Kanban. The real question is, why are you doing it? And the labeling is just so you can talk about it like a process pattern.
Yeah.
So to me, Scrum is a process pattern.
Yeah.
Kanban is a process pattern. The Kanban method is a process pattern. XP is a process pattern. But that assumes you're coming from the perspective that, in fact, there are laws of nature of software development out there. Not everybody agrees with this, by the way. This is where Ken and I would disagree if we ever talked about it. We've never had that option. there are many in the Scrum community that don't believe you can talk about workflows and value streams without causing a lot of problems. I personally think you can, because I've seen it, I've done it, it helps. But there are a lot of people who think you become mechanistic if you do that. And it's possible to become mechanistic. I think Kanban method can become mechanistic. I've written about it in a blog I call Framework Myopia, where if you focus on one thing, then you tend to ignore other things.
That's right, yeah.
And our whole physiology, it's interesting. I usually don't try to study psychology. Actually, I study psychology and physiology a lot because just as a hobby, I think it's really fascinating stuff. I've got a background in psychology. I've always been interested in psychology. But it's interesting, if you study it, you'll notice the body, the brain, our whole physiology, our whole cognition is geared around focusing on one thing. We are designed as beings to focus on one thing. And you have some sensors that give us peripheral vision and things like that. But in fact, when you notice if we're in a fight or flight response, things just gel down to what we're afraid of. We just give our full attention to that. Yeah. So the danger in software development, in my mind, is when you start focusing on one thing.
Too focused.
Then you don't notice the other things. You just don't even see them. It's not like you see them and discount them. They don't ever show up in your cognition, in your consciousness. And that's what I meant by myopia. Because myopic people, they see something, but it's very limited and they can't see around it.
Yep.
And we're kind of becoming that way. So that's my, latest rant, is I'm trying to get people to take, how do you see what you need, and then how do you learn to see what you need next?
Yep.
And this is something that neither Scrum nor the Kanban method talk about. Scrum just says, well, start, remove impediments, but they don't tell you how or what. Kanban method says manage work in process, and you'll figure it out. Okay, great, but why should I? Well, because you're smart and we respect people. And I'm saying, well, if you respect me, you wouldn't make me reinvent the wheel. See, that's another difference in attitude. I respect people. I don't want them to waste their time figuring out what other people have figured out. To me, that's wasting their time.
Yeah.
So there are differences, and those differences are actually, it's not the difference in Scrum or Kanban or Lean, it's the difference in those mindsets of how do you help people, how do you learn, how many things do you focus on, are there rules to software, what are those rules, those are the differences.
And so you mentioned just briefly about rules of software, that software has natural rules. Could you expand on that a little bit? That's quite interesting.
There are not a lot of them, but there are a few that are far-reaching.
Yeah.
So one is if you start work and then stop it, and then you pick it up later, that will cause more work to be done.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and people call this task switching, and it isn't.
Yeah.
You task switch every morning. You go from sleeping to waking. So if I work on something Monday, and then I put it aside, and I pick it up on Tuesday, I've task switched. If I stop working on something Monday, and I pick up something else on Tuesday, I've task switched. If I work on one thing a day, that's minimal task switching. But if I work on Project A on Mondays, and then I work on Project B on Tuesday, and then Project C on Wednesday, and then I come back to A on Thursday, that will not be as efficient as if I work on A Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday until I finish it.
Absolutely.
It has to do with short-term versus long-term memory.
Yeah.
And it creates additional work for two reasons. One is I don't remember where I was.
Yeah.
But what's worse, somebody else might have been in my code.
Yeah.
Or somebody else might have changed the requirement. I can't get the response I want fast. So that is a rule of software, that if you delay the workflow where it's not in your advantage to do so. I mean, sometimes you got to, oh man, my brain's fried, I got to set this down. Okay, then that's good. But I'm talking about an interruption. I'm talking about I'm working on something, I stop, I go do something else, I now come back to it. That will cost me time. If requirements age, if I get some requirements today, 3 months from now, they're not as good. That's not your opinion. That's not my opinion. That's just the way it is. Those are things I'm talking about. If I work on really, really big things in parallel with each other, it won't work as well as if I get something done and finished.
Yep.
The Agile community and the Agile Manifesto refers to some of these things, but it doesn't make it clear and explicit enough. For the example, finished code is a better measure than have I got some artifact in front of me. Yeah. It's not, again, it's not your opinion, it's not my opinion. It just is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That's what I mean when I say law.
Right.
I mean, it's not our opinion about it.
Yeah.
We have nothing to say about it. You can like or dislike gravity, but it's still gravity.
Yeah.
How you talk about it might make you more effective in dealing with gravity, but whatever phenomenon is out there, it will pull on you regardless of what your opinion about it is.
Yeah.
So there are things like that in software that a lot of people are actually denying. They're saying, well, it's complex. We can't, and I'm now using complex in the Kinefin model of, or even what, they're not exactly consistent, but Kinefin or Jürgen Appello talks about it being that, you can't get cause and effect. And the answer is, that's actually not what it means. That's not what complexity means. There are patterns to complex things.
Yeah.
And you can get some cause and effect. You just don't get exact predictability. I mean, I can guarantee you if I go into a movie theater and scream fire or scream bomb or shoot a couple of shots in the air, I'm pretty sure they're going to leave and the screaming and yelling is going to ensue.
Yeah.
But what exits they go to, I can't predict that. But there are certain patterns of behavior you can definitely predict.
Yeah.
So even in complex systems, there are rules. The cause and effect may not be totally clear. But it doesn't mean there is none. It just means we don't necessarily understand it. But we can sometimes see big pictures of things. So this is an area that people have pretty much ignored, except for, not everybody. Don Reinertson's book, if you've not read it, Principles of Lean Product Development Flow, boy, he talks about, this is like a Bible of software engineering. It's just an amazing tome. Definitely read it. It's just Don Reinertson, Principles... What is the book? It's Reinertson's book. I think it's Principles of Lean Product Development.
I'll look it up. I'll look it up on Amazon and post it into the interview.
It's not an easy read. I'll warn you. Principles of Product Development Flow, second generation Lean Product Development. But it is brilliant. It is a brilliant book. Lots of equations, lots of graphs and stuff. But it's not hard to read. I think it's very clear, but you have to read it carefully.
Right.
You know what I mean?
You got to give it your full attention.
Yeah. It's not something you got to give it your full attention. But if you give it your full attention and you read it, you will understand it. It's very well written. Whereas I've read some books, like the Gang of Four book. When I first read that, it was like I was giving it my full attention, and it was hitting a brick wall. About 6 months later, I got this insight that broke that whole thing open for me. But I read that for months, saying, well, I know there's some real good stuff in here because I can smell it, but I don't see it yet, and that was an interest, the Design Patterns book.
Yeah.
That was a book that was really obtuse. It has brilliance. Then when you break the code, it becomes, oh my goodness, this is such an amazing book.
Yeah.
But it was very difficult to get to that point.
Yeah. So just taking a quick step back, just to sort of trace through your path through Scrum and through Lean as well. You mentioned that right at the very start, you were introduced to, I think you said Extreme Programming by Martin Fowler, and then you moved into the Scrum community. At what point were you thinking heavily on Lean? Because I seem to remember that we chatted at, I think it was Amazon in 2008, and you were already starting to think quite heavily in the Lean fashion.
It was about 2004, 2005 that I started getting into Lean in a big way.
So that was quite early on, actually.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because the basics of Lean I had in 83.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I was studying Deming back in 83, 84.
Yeah.
Like 84. It was actually 84. So when Mary, I started meeting, I met Mary before her book came out. She was also in the Scrum community, and we chatted a lot back then. So I made a connection with her back in 2002, 2003, heavy in 2004. Yeah. And so Lean made immediate sense to me. It was like, wow, this just explains whole bunches of stuff. And I could never get Ken interested in going down that path. And every time I would talk to him, he would say he was interested. And then when it actually came time to action, it was always, well, no, I'm doing my thing. And we never could agree. And then, for a year or two, I was like, man, I really hope the Scrum community will absorb Lean and move in this direction. But since nobody was interested, and after a couple of years, I started thinking, well, I'm going to talk about this. I'm talking about it inside the community, and nobody else is doing anything about it. So apparently it was okay to talk about it inside the community, but once I started talking about it outside the community, people didn't appreciate that. Because they couldn't control it, I guess. So when we started in 2008, I'd been already doing Lean for a few years. My problem, and it was right about that time that it started shifting for me, my problem was I just had Lean as a theoretical framework that I could sometimes intuit solutions out of. And I did. I mean, there were some things we did that were just really cool, really remarkable. And I look back on it, I recognize I was managing flow well and a variety of things like that. But it wasn't until I started doing Kanban, which was right around 2008, that I started having a set of practices that would implement these principles that I understood the principles, but I didn't understand how you'd actually manifest it. And in hindsight, it's like, wow, I don't quite see how I missed it, but I did. So I have David to thank for that because he made it really clear. Actually, he didn't invent Kanban, but he was the one who promoted it. There were a couple other people like Corbis and Microsoft who invented it, but in the same way Ken didn't invent Scrum, Jeff did. Ken formalized it, and so around 2008, 2009, all of a sudden I had a way to make Lean work from a practical point of view. And at that point, though, I didn't truly appreciate the importance of teams. So I kind of went from heavy Scrum to heavy Lean. And then, a couple of years ago, I went back to kind of more mid-range, believing teams are great. Always try to get to them if you can. And jump as far as you can, but don't overjump. So, the Kanban method, rather, of always doing incremental improvement makes sense if that's all you can do, but it doesn't make sense if you can actually rearrange workflow, use minimal business increments or whatever. And this is where David and I started splitting up to some level, as I started talking about, well, the Lean method's great, but it's just one of many things, and he didn't want to hear that. So, basically what happened to me